Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of A.IdlePodcast, the podcast where I do weekly book reviews. This week, I read The Piano Lesson by August Wilson. Released in 1987, this centers around a Black family that is only a few generations removed from slavery, who has roots in Mississippi, but is currently settled in Pittsburgh in the 1930s. Now, the piano lesson is basically this conversation or at time arguments regarding what to do with the family piano. Now, this piano was originally bought by their family's master, who literally traded two, well, as they say in the text, 1.5 enslaved people for this piano. So this was actually bought with people, bought with souls. And so the lesson is what to do with this piano now that we're several generations past that, but we have this instrument. And so how the lesson is ultimately solved is the conclusion of the book, which I won't really get into, just to leave a little bit to surprise, but it does have a conclusion. Now, immediately we are introduced to this family by Boy Willie and Lyman just showing up to Bernice's house early in the morning, acting a fool. Now, for those that hear August Wilson's name and it sounds familiar, that's because this is also the writer of Fences, which in the past few years has been popularized by the adaptation, but as well as Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which again has had a recent adaptation on Netflix, I believe. So August Wilson has a variety of work out there. He has a lot. So I definitely recommend just purchasing something from his collection or all of them and taking a read if you like this one. Now, the piano is without a doubt the main character of this stage play. It's in the title, it's on the cover of this published version, but it also is the center of a lot of the conflict in the story, but also it's almost what's holding the family together. So the piano, like I mentioned before, was bought with people, and then the family actually took the piano back, the family of those enslaved members. And in that kind of chaos of taking the piano back, a few people lost their lives. So there's a lot of souls that are surrounding this piano or protecting it or just watching over it, whatever may have you. There's something about this piano that requires protection at this point. And so it's kind of alluded to the fact that there are, whether you want to call it ghosts or spirits or souls, whatever may have you, they're connected to this piece. And the importance in the piano is established and reestablished via the stakes of the family. Now, the family of the enslaved members, they, over the years, have kept the piano, kept it very polished and clean, and it's become a source of pride. So even though it's been the center of causing a lot of pain, it's also now something that is held in a very high regard. Now, when we're talking about those spirits or the souls or the ghost, there's a word for that in this script, which is the ghost of Yellow Dog. Now, I thought that was a euphemism at first, but it really is just the ghost that passed when they were retaliated against for taking the piano back. And the Yellow Dog is just a train that goes through the town in Mississippi, I believe. And so they died on the train. So the ghosts of Yellow Dog are allegedly responsible for a few deaths back home. And it's assumed that those deaths of those people are in a way connected to what happened a generation prior with taking the piano back. So there's a lot surrounding this piano. Obviously, it's very accurately titled The Piano Lesson. Now, let's get into actual characters, the people. So, Boy Willie and Bernice are siblings, and their father actually was one of the souls that was murdered once they took the piano back. So, they kind of have a very odd relationship. Boy Willie is, I would describe him as having a very childlike demeanor, and not in a bad way, just in a way that he hasn't developed a respect for authority or a respect for order or just rules. And I say that because he kind of thumbs his nose at authority at every chance. When it comes to order, he just busts in Bernice's house, 5 o'clock in the morning, just acting all crazy and loud. So clearly there's no type of boundaries. But at the same time, that kind of feeds the ambition that he has, which again is not a bad thing. But those two combined, it's almost like it creates a recklessness that, if channeled correctly and appropriately, can really get things done, because there's this high ambition that other people won't have because they're not willing to think outside the box. But with him, it's like keep an eye on him at all times, But he wants to sell the piano to purchase land down south. And he just wants to sell this piano to the highest bidder. So it doesn't really matter who it goes to. He's just trying to get as much money as possible so he can buy this land down south. Bernice, on the other hand, is someone who is very responsible. She has a child and she keeps her house in a certain way. She runs it a certain way. But she's also grief-stricken. And we don't catch this until a little later on into the play. But she is recently widowed, and her husband was on some type of escapade with Boy Willie, and he ended up being murdered. And so she holds this resentment towards Boy Willie, and that plays a role in how tense their relationship is today, because she still hasn't really gotten over her husband passing. And now Boy Willie shows up and wants to sell the piano. She's not having it. So she wants to keep the piano out of respect for their father, who was murdered in the process of bringing it back into the family. But it's weird because at the same time, she holds the piano in a high regard, but she won't touch it anymore. She doesn't want to play it. She lets her child play on it, but she doesn't really want to, be around it like that. She just wants it in her possession because of all that was lost to get it, which, makes sense. Now, Lyman is like, he shows up with Boy Willie at the beginning of the play, and that's his friend. When I was reading through it, he kind of struck me as just Boy Willie's sidekick, because he would always do anything that Boy Willie asked him to do. There's a point in the play where Boy Willie is just about to literally take the piano out of the house while Bernice is standing there telling him not to do it. And he's like, Lyman, get this, pick this up, let's go, we're getting it done. And he just goes on and goes with it. And in a way, though, there's this naiveness about him. There's this ignorance that he doesn't really understand how the world works just yet. And he's slightly gullible because he buys this old suit off of Whining Boy later on. So it's like, I kind of had a very low regard for him at first. And then I watched the adaptation with Courtney B. Vance, and I watched how he played that, and it had me think in a completely different way. I still think he's a little naive, but he has this childlike wonder about him where he believes that there's nothing left for him in the South, and that the North is where he's going to create a new prosperous life. Which, in that, we have this underlying conversation of what is best for the Black family during the 1930s. Is it better to stay down south where presumably a lot of their ancestors and their family members worked the land down there, so they know what they're doing, they know how to do it? Or is it better to come to a land, the North, which for a lot of people was very unfamiliar at that time, still not as welcoming? This is the 1930s, they still weren't really kicking it with black folks like that, but there's this realm of possibility. So that's like an underlying issue with Lyman, but he's still he gives sidekick vibes. But I guess it really just depends on the performance, because I didn't get, from the adaptation that I saw, I didn't get that he was like stupid or anything, but just that he was so in awe of being in the North and that he was just ready to conquer everything, which is, a good trait to have, even if it's a little bit, naive. And the last two characters, Doker and Whining Boy. So Doker and Whining Boy are brothers, and they are also the uncles to Bernice and Boy Willie. So their brother, who is the father of Bernice and Boy Willie, actually passed trying to get the piano back. So Doker is the one he's not only the mediator for this family, he stops a lot of these arguments from turning into full-on fights and full-on murders in some cases, but he's also the storyteller. He's the one that passes the history down to the next generation. So through him, the reader learns about what happened with this piano, why it was so important to the family, and how it caused so many lives to be lost. And so he's providing this background for us to figure out whose side we're going to be on. He's just a really good source of wisdom throughout the entire story. And I like that his character wasn't necessarily written to take a side or to deem any one character right or wrong. He just is telling you the information, and that's that. Whining Boy, I have no idea why this character was included in the story, only because it's very clear that he hasn't done as much with his life as he would like for everyone else to believe. And maybe that's the point of the character, to provide what am I looking for? To provide such a different picture than what Doker is doing. Doker at this point, he has money because, he had a job. So he had several decades of working, and I want to say he's retired now. He's getting his pension out or something like that. But either way, he has his life on track, whereas Whining Boy is always around asking for money. And he's a supposed musician, but it's like he hasn't really done much with it. So I guess these are the two realities of what could happen to a family that may have been in that migration from the South to the North. So other than that, I just didn't really understand why he was there, because he's like a drunk. And so when he wasn't talking about how much money he needed and he needed to hold $1 and this and hold $1 that, he was just drunk. So I don't know. Okay, and the last thing I want to touch on here is music. So of course, when you're reading a stage play or a script, it's difficult to wrap your head around the rhythm or the melody of a specific song. You may be able to read out the lyrics, but you're just reading it almost like poetry. So we don't know the tone necessarily of the music. So when it comes to the musicality of the piano lesson, I think it's very important to see it live. So to look up one of the adaptations or one of the live versions. There's a couple versions online for free. Or of course, if it's playing at your local theater, go see it. But from the lyrics, we can derive that the words have literal meaning, and a lot of the time it's painting a picture of the work that they were doing down south as hardworking men down there, and it tinted their history there as very sad and kind of there's a word for this, but I'm not remembering it, but basically like there's no future for them down there. And it reminded me a lot of some of the songs that the enslaved people would sing, where it's not they're not singing because they're happy. They're singing to provide a sense of community for the other enslaved people around them, or to give them encouragement to get through the rest of the day. And so we're getting this soundtrack to the hardships of their lives, basically. So you can read through the lyrics in the book. I will say, of course, the performances in the adaptation gave it much more life, and it was really amazing to see. There was one point where a bunch of them kind of came together in song, and it was so lively, and I felt like I was getting a piece of history, hearing them sing the way that they would sing on I'm thinking like sharecropping, because this is kind of that time period where we're phasing out of working the fields and stuff like that. So I would just definitely recommend, if nothing else, to see some sort of live version of this for the music, because it was amazing. It was great. And I've always wondered how that works with writers, like, because I would assume we know what we would want the lyrics to be. Obviously, we know what we want the meaning to be literally, but how do you write in the music aspect of it, the melodies, the rhythm, and the overall just tone? Okay, so in this published version, there is a foreword by Toni Morrison, and I held off on reading it until the end because I knew that she was going to give me some good information, but I also wanted to make sure that my analysis and my takes weren't going to be tainted. But it's so funny because we're basically understanding the same things from the writing. She hit on the socioeconomic status of the descendants of enslaved people very well. She analyzed and assessed the works of August Wilson as a whole against other critically acclaimed writers at that time period, and so what they brought to the table and why all of them were necessary, essentially. And she gives us almost like this mini analysis on the piano lesson itself. So if you're going to go out and buy the stage play, I would get this version just for Toni Morrison's foreword. You know I like Toni Morrison, so she did a great analysis of it beforehand. So it's my personal opinion that anything that August Wilson writes is a reread, because I see this as being one of those pieces taught in like an English class. Much like how a lot of us had to read A Raisin in the Sun, this is very very helpful to paint the picture of what a Black family would have been tasked with doing in the 1930s and the 1920s, and what types of challenges they were looking at. Because again, we have to understand that being a few generations removed from slavery, they didn't own anything, so they had to kind of just start building from scratch. So when you look at the biggest conflict in this play about selling the piano or not selling the piano, there's really no right or wrong answer for that. Like, I found myself, as I'm reading through it, saying whether or not Boy Willie gets his way or Bernice gets her way, I'm not really mad at it either way, because it's like Boy Willie is thinking, well, I want to sell this piano to buy some land, because land is going to be an investment that pays off for all of us. And in his mind, he already knows how to work it, and like this could take care of the family, for generations to come. Whereas Bernice wants to keep something that was sentimental to the family and that was literally paid for by the family lives. So I thought that was a very I don't want to say unique, because that's not a unique discussion, and there's still to this day conversations happening like this in households everywhere, but for that time period, I don't hear enough people talk about how much Black people had to start over after they were freed from slavery. So my only takeaway is along those lines, which basically that investment for the future is great. So Boy Willie's idea of taking this land and flipping it and turning it into something super profitable, amazing, great plan. However, in the meantime, somebody has to be working a 9-to-5 to provide a stable environment, and an environment for the children to thrive and learn and just pay some bills so that eventually, somebody could buy a house or something. So that's my only takeaway. I thought this was great and it'll stay on my shelf. I have Fences as well. So eventually I'll read that one. That's one that I didn't see the latest adaptation, and I've never seen a live version of that. So that will be a brand new experience for me. Whereas with the piano lesson, I know a little bit about it, but yeah. So thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. I will see you all next week. Thank you.